Hello and welcome to Ventures and Visionaries, episode 13 at TOC, Theory of Constraints and Process Optimization. I'm your host, Morty Ankel, fractional CTO, entrepreneur, coach, and mentor. This podcast is about leadership, entrepreneurship, business, and innovation. But do these different areas contrast and complement? And it's definitely about creating business leverage. The podcast is sponsored by KJ Technology. KJ is a strategic IT and cybersecurity advisory services company. Dave McFarland is our guest today. He is an investor, advisor, and innovator. Dave has a varied and very interesting background, and we'll get into that in just a moment. And in short, I'm really excited to dive into Dave's insights. So please join me in welcoming Dave to the podcast. Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Marty. Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
I think so. I'm really excited. Firstly, we're going to get to TOC in a moment because that's a near and dear story to my heart. But the world to TOC for most people seems to be fraught with twists and turns, and that seems to be your story as well.
Indeed.
So how did you get into what you got into, and maybe give me the unabridged version?
Yeah. So a lot of people find it weird based on what my LinkedIn profile says now, is that I used to be a biologist. So I have a master's degree in biology. So I started out as a bench scientist. So I was, using pipetters and test tubes in a hood. That's where I started. So I worked at a university laboratory. I worked for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. I worked for Big Pharma. And then I worked for a small biotech startup. So I did all of those things and thought, I was going to be in science. At one point, I was even in a PhD program for pharmacology and toxicology. So I thought I was going to do science. Well, life had
a different
ideas,
opinion.
right?
Yeah.
So the small biotech, the reason I came back to Illinois where I am now was because of that company. So it was started by someone I used to work with at the University of Illinois. And so I came back here, and he hired me for my technology skills and my biology background to work in his company. So I thought it was great. It was a good environment. I was here a few years, and he sold his company to Sony, which people say, Sony Biotechnology. I said, well, if you look it up, there's now a company called Sony Biotechnology. We were the first company that Sony acquired in the biotechnology space. But after a while, Sony kind of changed their tune about what they were doing. And so the owner was let go. And then shortly after, it was pretty clear that they were going to kind of dismantle what was going on here in Champaign. I went through several roles at that company, and my last role was the quality manager. So I kind of moved out of science already at that point, and I was working more in the manufacturing area, dealing with problems there, dealing with supplier issues and that type of stuff. So that's where I was when I finally left Sony. So myself and a lot of other people were let go. They closed the office here. They moved operations to Japan and California. So here I am in Central Illinois, biology degree, worked in biotech and big pharma. I'll let you a little secret. There's not much of that here. Right? So I had to make a decision, right? Am I going to continue that path? If so, I'm going to have to move somewhere, or I'm going to have to do something different. So I decided to do something different. So my daughter was about 6 or 7 at that time. And so I decided I want to do something different. Well, since I had been the quality manager at that point, I was like, okay, well, there's some stuff you can do related to quality. So I became a quality systems auditor. And I also started a consulting business at the same time. And that's where I really got into manufacturing. I joined the American Society for Quality. I got some certificates there. But better yet is I got to visit a lot of companies. So over 10 years between auditing and consulting, I visited about 150 factory floors. And somewhere in that time, I also became a big fan of theory of constraints um, because of the relationship to quality systems, operations, and whatnot. And so that's really how I got on the path to where I'm at now. Um, this year, something's changed even more is that I'm now trying to be a business owner. So that's where the investor part comes in. I'm actually trying to buy a small manufacturing business. So I think that's enough twists and turns. That's how I got to where I am now.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things that I'm very interested in learning about and hearing more about, and I think our listeners are as well, is some of us are afraid to take a plunge or to embrace life when life throws us a curveball. So um, to understand that at some point there is some sort of a silver lining, or at least for others there has been, and maybe draw some inspiration there, I think is very, very worthwhile. And Dave, so let's talk a little bit about TOC. And you said that you started observing it in the quality side. So, I mean, again, my experience with TOC started with when I read The Goal years ago. And that was a pure manufacturing, flow story. So maybe you can explain a little bit. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about theory of constraints for those of us who don't know, and then we can talk a little bit more about where this went in the world of quality.
Sure. So when I got into quality, that's how I got introduced. Of course, you're going to get introduced to Deming when you talk quality, but I also got introduced to Dr. Goldratt. So I said that I have several ASQ certifications, and the goal was required reading for those certifications. So that's how I really got introduced to it. And a lot of the people that follow TOC and Goldratt himself don't talk too much about quality. But then when they talk about Deming, all they talk about is quality. But Deming was also a management guru, right? So those two play very nicely together. So as far as what TOC is, I'll give you the really short version of there's just too much to talk about. But basically, the way I look at TOC is the reason it's called theory of constraints is because Goldratt's theory, being a scientist himself, his theory was that every system has one constraint, just like a chain has one weakest link. And that's really the main point. And what he said is, if you have one main constraint, that's where your focus should be, right? So just like a chain, if you have a chain with a weak link, you don't want to strengthen all the links. That doesn't help the chain. In fact, all it does is add weight. What you want to focus on is the weakest link. That's what's going to give you the most bang for your buck. And as you said, it started out really just a manufacturing thing, right? Manufacturing solution. And so now, as it's evolved and as Goldratt wrote more books, there's a manufacturing solution. It's called drum buffer rope. Weird name, good system. There's a project management solution called critical chain. And then there's a distribution or inventory management solution called replenishment, which is has a lot of similarities to the lean supermarket approach, right? So those are the three main solutions in theory constraints. But then also they have something called the thinking processes. And so these are tools that just what they say, they're trying to help you think and solve problems. So they're graphical, right? So they make you write things down and draw things in arrows and boxes. So there are 5 main thinking processes. And I don't think we need to go into them, but they're really great because they help you work through your problems and getting it out graphically. Your mind just works a little differently. And then they are all based on one of 2 types of logic, either cause-effect logic, right? So you say if, then this, or necessary condition logic, which means in order to have this, I must do this. And basically, it's logical tools. And the other thing they help you do, which is something that I don't see done enough, is they help you challenge assumptions. And so have you ever been in a place where you ask them why they do something And they say, well, we just always done it that way. Right. And the problem is,
that sounds like the brisket or the ham story, depending on which, tradition you come from.
yes, I know the ham story. And so they say, you should always challenge those assumptions because there might be something hitting there that you're doing that either you shouldn't be doing, or maybe there's something better that you should be doing. And that's, in a nutshell, what theory of constraint is about.
So, firstly, thank you. I think that was really great. And the idea of visualizing the thinking systems as well as visualizing the critical chain or the weakest link, as you've discussed, it makes it very attainable. And one of the things that I think I read in one of the editions of the Goals Introduction, Goldratt writes that he had this system for a while and no one was buying into it until he wrote the goal in a story format, and then that started flying off the shelves, which I thought was just fascinating in the sense that, people don't really resonate with the scientific proof, but if they hear a story, they can sort of incorporate it, or a simple analogy, simple story. It's just interesting. I don't know if that's been your experience as well as you try to do transformation. Sorry.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And for me, it was both interesting and maddening, right? Because coming from a science background, I'm used to reading textbooks and they tell you, this is how you do it. This is the first step. This is the second. And he didn't do that, right? As you said, it's a novel and he really loved the Socratic method, right? He's going to ask you questions. He's going to make you figure it out for yourself. Could he have just written a book saying, do this, do this, do this, do this? He could have, but he didn't. And I think part of the reason he did it was I never met the man, but I know several people that have. And so, his philosophy was he wanted to challenge people and he wanted to make them stretch. And this is something I've learned as a consultant. And I think he knew this too, is that if you just go in somewhere and you tell everyone, you're all wrong, I'm right, this is the way to do it, it doesn't work so well, right? You need to give them some information and say, hey, what do you think about this? How could you use this? How would this work here? And then they'll come up with their own solution. And it's going to work much better, even if it's not the perfect solution, because they'll do it. And that's more important than having it perfect.
My business partner always says that people don't argue with their own ideas. And therein perhaps lies the rub. Interestingly, I read some time ago that when I think it was Duncan Hines, when they invented the brownie mix or whatever, some other, those self-baked cakes, that that they started putting them, and really all you needed to add was water, and nobody bought them. But then they realized that, and then I think they pulled out the eggs in the oil. They did some survey. I don't remember exactly how that happened, but it really became a big hit once people felt like it was their own. They added their own eggs. They added their own oil. It was their own cake, even though it was a mix. So I just think it's a very interesting, similar thing on human psychology.
Reminds me of the old story, Stone Soup. You want to talk
about
the
story? If you can share it with the listeners, I'd appreciate that. Yeah. I think it's a great story.
Yeah. So Stone Soup, a gentleman comes into town and, he's weary traveler and he has no food. And so he gets out his kettle of water and he starts boiling the water and he takes the stone and he puts it in the pot. And so that makes people curious and people come up and say, well, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm making my soup. Well, you just put a stone in it. He goes, yeah, it's my own special recipe. It's stone soup. You could join me if you like. And so they sit there curious and they talk for a while. And he goes, if I only had some potatoes. I mean, stone soup is good, but stone soup with potatoes is fantastic. So the person goes out and they bring back some potatoes. And he goes through the same spiel for a while. Someone else comes along. Oh, it'd be great if I had some carrots. So carrots and potatoes and stone soup would be better. And it goes on, right? And so they all join in. They make it their own soup, and everybody's the better for it.
I love that story. It's people are inherently collaborative. I really feel that to me, that's the message of that story. I would imagine some other people in a more cynical view can have a slightly different approach to that as well. But just back to TOC. I know you've mentioned Deming and you've mentioned there are other systems like Lean or Six Sigma. Anything that you would like to share in your experience in manufacturing for somebody who's just thinking through some of these, and even if not for manufacturing, like how these quality performance flow systems tend to interplay with each other, what works best, and how would you think about them?
Yeah. So being out in manufacturing, probably Lean is the thing you see most, right? So Lean or now Lean Six Sigma, they kind of smash those together, is what you see the most, and you don't see TOC as much. And I've often thought, why is that? And the only thing I can come up with is marketing, right? I think that's really what it comes down to. I think that those two were marketed better. Certainly, they have utility, and people can do good things with them. But I can't say always. Once I discovered TOC, that became my go-to. And the reason is the focus component. So Goldratt was captured saying once that he could define TOC in one word, and what that word is focus. And so that's what I think that the other two, Lean and Six Sigma, could use more of, is more focus. And so if you start with a TOC approach, those other tools work great, but let's consider continuous improvement, right? You hear that a lot, right? Well, most places, continuous improvement means, well, let's improve everything everywhere a little bit. And the idea is that if we do that, then the whole is going to be better. And Goldratt argued against that. He said that's not true. And in fact, sometimes improving over here actually hurts things over here. So you shouldn't improve each individual process. That's just like improving each link on the chain. You should focus where you need the improvement, and you improve the whole system. So that's one thing I think that TOC brings to the table. And for the most part, TOC doesn't conflict with Lean and Six Sigma, with a couple of rare examples. But you mentioned flow, right? So Lean is all about flow. TOC is all about flow. But how they do it is a little bit different. So if you've ever taken a class on Lean or worked in a Lean factory, right, they do the takt times, and what they try to do is balance the line, right? So what they do, they balance the line. The problem is what they call a balanced line isn't really balanced, right? They balance the average time, right? Well, what does that mean? That means, okay, well, this one is the average. Well, what's our spread in that average, right? So let's say the first step and the last step, one's at the low end of the average, and one's at the high end, right? Well, what you've just done is you've created a bottleneck. And in a balanced system, that bottleneck moves around because on a day-to-day basis, your average moves around, right? So theory of constraints takes a different approach. It says, okay, don't balance the line. Take what you've got, right? And find the constraint. And what you want to do is just make sure that constraint doesn't stop, right? Everything in the factory is really based on how fast things go through the constraint. And the other thing is Six Sigma, right? They're all about reducing variation. Okay, so that's why Lean and Six Sigma work well together, right? Because I want to balance the line, and I have an average time, but I have a big spread. Well, maybe we can use Six Sigma tools to reduce that spread, and that makes the line more balanced. That's not untrue. But what theory constraint says is A, you can't have it ever completely balanced, right? You can't get rid of all waste, and you can't get rid of all variation. So instead, let's deal with it, and let's put buffers in the right place to deal with that variation. So that's a very different philosophy. But again, it's not like it's in direct contrast to it. It's actually a good complement in my mind.
So, well, okay, we can go in a couple of different directions, but let's go first into, in this situation where identifying the bottleneck is complicated or identifying the constraints complicated, how do you go about doing that? Because especially in a situation where everybody that I know of is very passionate about self-improvement. So if you're perpetually self-improving, you're doing exactly what you suggested. And then A, identifying the constraint is incredibly difficult. And B, it's going to shift on you on a relatively regular basis. So how does one go about thinking about those things?
Well, the first thing I would say is I don't think it is that difficult to find it if you do it the right way. So the reason it's difficult sometimes is if you have a balance line and you operate that way, and you're trying to hold that balance line, then the bottleneck is going to move from day to day. But that's a design issue. That's not an identification issue. That's a design issue, right? And in fact, what you'll notice sometimes in lean operations, they'll have like a floater, right? And the floater basically moves to wherever the bottleneck is and helps out, right? And so that's their approach. Theory of constraints is going to work better actually if you have a balance line first, right? So if you might have to unbalance it, and that really freaks people out sometimes. So if you remember in the goal, that wasn't an issue, right? They didn't think about balancing the line because they had these operations that ended at this heat treat, right? And it took like 8 hours, right? It's like, well, whatever operations you're doing around that, you're not going to be able to reduce your heat treat to your takt time of those other things, right? So that's a perfect situation to apply theory constraints. What most people get wrong, and this is what they don't like to do, they're very resistant. The first step, if you're trying to find the bottleneck, is you have to choke the release of orders, right? Because if the factory is full of work in process, it looks like everything's a constraint, right? You got piles of stuff in front of every operation. Well, which one's the constraint? They all look like a constraint. And if you just try to use data to see what's there, it's not going to work very well. So what you have to do is you have to choke the release, and you have to see which piles evaporate. The places where the piles evaporate aren't the constraint. The place where the pile stays is the constraint.
And that's a very visual way to find the issue.
Yeah.
So interesting. So you had mentioned that, go ahead.
Now, I was just going to add one more thing that a lot of people don't understand is there can be multiple constraints, but it's in different systems. So if you have a factory and you have 10 products, those are basically 10 different systems. And if they take 10 different paths, you might have to find the constraint in each path. If they converge, like let's say you have 10 product lines that all go through one operation, it's a good chance that one operation that they all go through is going to be your constraint.
Fascinating. So let's talk about moving some of this into project management or into some of the other areas. I recently read a book on the theory of constraint in DevOps, and people seem to be expanding the thinking process into just general processes that don't really seem as visible, and identifying piles of inventory perhaps is not as readily available. Do you have any insights that you can share on, say, doing project management in the critical chain theory?
Yeah, project management is I think the critical chain is actually in some ways easier to understand than the drum buffer rope manufacturing. And in fact, I've used the critical chain approach in a factory because what they were building wasn't, just stamping out the part thousands and thousands. It was more of a project. They had, like 20 different subassemblies that had to come together at the end. So critical chain approaches actually can work in that situation too. In project management, you don't have to be making a physical product at all to use critical chain. So in a manufacturing environment, the place that you would usually use that is like engineering and design work, right? That's a great place to use critical chain. You could even use it if, say, you're doing a Six Sigma project. You could do that with a critical chain approach. But let's say you're a graphic design house or something. Critical chain's perfect. My wife works for a company that does continuing medical education. Great example, right? You got a bunch of writers. They're on 10 different projects at the same time. You got all these projects coming in. That would be a great place to do critical chain.
So how would you identify, say, a bottleneck in that scenario?
Well, it's similar, right? So you can't go around and look through the factory, but you can see, okay, which things are coming late, right? Which deliverable isn't moving forward, right? Let's look at that. Generally speaking, for like if you have an engineering department or if you have like a writing department like that, generally speaking, the you think that the bottleneck is the engineer or the writer, but in many cases, it's either some administrative task or, and this is what wasn't originally in the goal, but there's what can be called policy constraints, right? So, for instance, I worked at a place, where the policy was for the engineers, you have to have at least 5 projects you're working on all the time. But that's actually not a good way to get things through the system, right? That's not good flow, right? And so, well, what am I working on today? Well, whoever screams the loudest, that's what I work on today, right? That's the way a lot of these systems work. And critical change says, don't do that, right? Multitasking is bad, right? You want to, and Lean preaches this too, right? So Lean says, if you pick up something, you don't put it down till you're finished. But most project management situations, they do just the opposite. They say, oh, well, you got to have 5 or 10 projects at the same time. And on a daily basis, you might touch all of them. So you're constantly going back and forth. And that's not good for flow, right?
Yeah, that does not appear to be good for flow. And yet somehow, while mathematically that is proven, human intuition tells you with all the fibers of your being, why do you have people who are sitting around doing nothing or seemingly doing nothing? Shouldn't they be working on something?
Well, that's part of the problem, actually, Morty, is that theory of constraints says sometimes somebody doing nothing is the right thing. Right?
Which when I read, I was blown away by.
Yes. I'll give you a really good example. So this is in healthcare. And I just read about this recently. This is a real experience with someone. So they had some TOC people come in to a hospital setting, and we're trying to improve their throughput, right? And what they found was their constraint was the suites where they do the surgery, right? So what they
just
found.
A second, before I just make sure I understand. So throughput in this instance would be surgically treated patients?
That's right. So they made most of their money on doing surgeries, right? Okay. So throughput, you want to maximize the dollars typically, right? Okay. So that's what they just say, how can we do more surgeries?
Okay.
So, if looking from outside of the first thing you might say is, well, we need more doctors. Well, they say, okay, well, but let's see what's going on. And what they found was after a surgery, sometimes it would take 2 to 3 hours before the surgery suite was ready to do the next surgery. Right. So they said, that's the problem, is that we're wasting our constraint. We're waiting on it, right? So waiting on your constraint is bad, but sometimes people waiting is good. And so what they did, they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a cleaning crew, and their job is they're going to sit outside of the surgery suite. And most of their day, they're sitting there waiting. But when the surgery's done, they're in there like that, and they can turn around the surgery suite in 30 minutes.
It's fascinating. It's interesting because when we hired somebody a number of months ago, his prior job was being a medical devices salesperson, and he would sit in the surgery operating theater with the surgeons, and if they needed a piece or whatever it was his job to go and get it, or whatever it was. I guess to your point, if you need to optimize for the surgery and make sure that the surgeries flow, then that's really the key.
Exactly. So the bad part of the story is that later on, the hospital hired a new manager of maintenance. The manager came around, he saw these people sitting outside the surgery suite. So what are you doing? I'm not paying you to sit around. So he gave them something else to do, and it broke the system. Right.
And what happened in the end? Like all the efficiencies essentially flew out the window.
Exactly. So then what would happen was they'd say, okay, we're done with the surgery. Where's our crew? Well, they're working on something. I couldn't let them sit around and do nothing, right? We're not paying them to do nothing. So then, well, what do they do? Well, they're working somewhere else. They'll be done in about an hour, and then they'll come do your. So they went back to the old system, right?
And lost all their abilities to gain. It's interesting because, again, like to the point that the math proves itself, and yet it's just counterintuitive. So speaking of thinking systems, which you had mentioned earlier, and if we need to prove things by logic and math, especially in an area that's counterintuitive, well, let's maybe go into technology for a minute. Do you think there'll be systems that'll help identify the counterintuitive but more correct way of doing things?
Yeah, I mean, there already are. So digital twins is one way to do it. So the Goldratt Institute, run by Dr. Alan Bernard, that's one of the key tools that he uses. And so he was a contemporary of Dr. Goldratt, so he worked with him for years. And so, yeah, he utilizes technology. And basically, the nice thing about digital twins is you can put all the data in the system and ask some what if questions. What if we did this? And then basically it will give you an output before you actually even make the change.
So they have some software that can essentially model the scenario.
Exactly.
And this is for manufacturing in particular?
Yeah, they have a couple of solutions. They have one that's for manufacturing, and it can do even elaborate analyses. Like, let's say, okay, you have a manufacturing, and we're not just trying to figure out how to make this site do better. Let's say that you want to expand around the country, right? They can even put in variables like that. Say, okay, where would be the best place to put our next location based on proximity of customers? So they can do some really interesting things that way. And then, so they have a manufacturing digital twin, and then they also have one for distribution systems.
Oh, interesting. One of the other TOC books I'm almost finished with is Store Distribution. I forget the name of it. Where, I don't know, in this particular story, somebody's pipe bursts, and therefore he discovers that his store performance increased dramatically because he was no longer holding the inventory, and the distribution center was fulfilling his orders on a daily.
Yeah.
That seems to be another outtake of this, that often smaller chunks are better than bigger, more elaborate things. Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the supermarket model, right? So that I use that story often to get across to manufacturers. I was like, this is the way a supermarket works, right? So they buy bread. They don't buy a month's worth of bread and keep it in the back, right? They get daily deliveries of bread, right? Now they started doing it for a different reason. They did it because the bread's going to spoil if they keep it around too long. But what they found is that they don't have to have a huge warehouse of inventory. And the other thing is their orders are always right-sized. So this is the replenishment model of TOC, right? You don't guess, you don't forecast how much am I going to sell in the next month or two. You say daily, okay, today I sold 10 loaves. I want 10 loaves coming in tomorrow. Tomorrow I sold 3 loaves. Okay, I only need 3 loaves. And so that's what the replenishment model and the supermarket model is. It's you just refill it. There are other cases where, this has been done forever. Vending machines. That's the model they've always used, right? So if you own a vending machine, you don't have a warehouse next to the vending machine with 2 months worth of material to sell, right? It just gets filled in, daily or weekly or whatever it is. And so that can be used in a large distribution system. And it can be used even in small warehouses. And the thing is, the bigger the system, the more powerful this is. Because remember, we were talking earlier about variability. And so, Six Sigma is trying to drive down the variability. Well, what TOC does, it uses math again, right? So if you have 10 different little warehouses, the variability in each warehouse is going to be very different, right? Let's say based on the climate or the area in the country, they're going to buy different things at different times, right? But if you took those 10 warehouses and all the material in it and put it in one warehouse, the variability would be minimal, because when this guy's selling a lot, this one isn't selling very much. And so they kind of even out. And so that's a really big benefit of using that approach.
Systemically, you mean?
Yeah.
Meaning the system itself doesn't have the variability.
Exactly.
On the individual pieces, they still would have the same variability, presumably.
Right. But it doesn't matter because we're reacting to that on a very short-term basis.
right? And it allows for a much more real-time response.
Exactly.
And I guess that in a world where, a black swan like COVID event, all this is good because you can to a certain degree predict. But when, I don't know, when everyone shut down all their factories and then all of a sudden the supermarkets ran out of product and then the world panicked and started buying things out of control. I guess those types of events are probably hard to predict in this scenario, frankly, any scenario.
Well, it's certainly impossible to predict, but I will tell you that was largely a self-inflicted wound, right? For two reasons. One, people, I went to my local Walmart, right? And so there's no, toilet paper or paper towels or anything. That's like, there wasn't really a shortage. It was just that people were buying 10 times what they needed. Seriously. And then in manufacturing, what compounded this is the computer systems, the ERP systems, the MRP systems making decisions for you, right? So, they have that min-max formula. And so as your lead time grows, you're supposed to hold more material, right? So when your vendor says, hey, your lead time is bigger, what did they do? They increased their size of their order. And everybody did that. And so it actually made the problem much, much worse. And then on top of that, I've been to places where the customers had to build bigger warehouses during COVID because they had so much stuff.
Fascinating. And how long does it take before that normalizes?
Well, I would say it hasn't yet. So it's taken a while. So, and here's the thing. There's even more repercussions. So it hurt the small manufacturers the worst because I've been to a number of them where they said it wasn't that the lead times grew, is that their supplier just says, we're not going to sell you any. The big boys are buying everything we can make. We don't even need your business. So that really hurt them. Okay. And then the other thing is, so now, we're through that ostensibly, but the problem is now it's like, oh yeah, well, we bought 10 times what we needed. So it's going to take us a while to get through that. Right. And so even worse, some of these companies ramped up production. They hired all these people because they were getting so many orders. And then all of a sudden that tap just got shut off. And so they found that it was kind of false demand. And in fact, some of the companies are saying, we bought too much. We want to send it back to you. So it created all kinds of problems because, we just knee-jerked and went too far in one direction. So I'm not saying there weren't real shortages, especially electronics, chips, and that stuff. That was a real deal. But things like toilet paper, there wasn't really a manufacturing problem with that. There wasn't really a shortage. It was just the consumption went through the roof because people panicked.
People heard a story on the newspaper that they were going to run out of toilet paper, and they went and bought a year and a half worth of the supply.
Self-fulfilling prophecy, yes.
Well, yeah, that's really remarkable. And I wonder what the thinking process of a Goldratt thinking tree would do to something like that.
Well, what they would do, they would tell you to challenge assumptions, right? So one assumption that some of these manufacturers didn't challenge is, oh, this is awesome. We have 10 times the amount of volume and sales that we've had. We got to ramp up and deal with that and get some stuff, right? It's like, but they didn't challenge the assumption. Is this real, right? Is it going to be maintainable? A good example of a company that just got trashed because of that is Peloton, right? During COVID, they were selling those bikes like crazy and they ramped up and their projections 3 years out were in the clouds. They should have challenged some of those assumptions.
Yeah. Unfortunately, hindsight is 2020, but it's definitely a good piece of advice for any business leader. And that is to ensure that you have challenged your assumptions and not going into them blind.
Absolutely. Do you ever see the movie? Oh my goodness, Brad Pitt, the zombies. I can't remember the name of the movie. But anyway, there was a scene in there where they're in Israel, and Israel seems to be the only place prepared for the zombie horde. And the reason they were prepared is because they had someone that challenged the groupthink. and said, okay, I'm going to assume that zombies are real. All the stuff that we're hearing is real, and we're going to make preparation for that, right? So he challenged the assumption that all of this was nonsense, and then they were the only ones prepared. It's a silly example.
I have to
but
look this up because sounds hilarious.
It was actually a pretty good movie. But
oh yeah, well,
yeah.
Not typically into the zombie apocalypse movies, but definitely sounds like something worth watching.
So
that's very funny.
World War Z. That was it. World War Z. World War Z.
World War Z. Okay, yeah. Definitely recommendation to all the listeners. Dave says that this is a good example of challenging assumptions. I like it. I like it very much. On the note of challenging assumptions, has there been any experience where you've had where something seems right and yet you know that you should be challenging assumptions there? Like, what kind of guidance do you give people to, again, let's go back to the example of the cleaning crew. You're the new manager of maintenance in the hospital. You see the cleaning crew sitting down and you're like, well, my assumption is they always need to be busy.
Yeah. So this goes back to, I'll give you an example. Using a very simple thinking tool to challenge assumptions, right? As you set it up and you say, okay, I put something in this box. If I do this, draw my arrow, then I get this, right? So that's your setup. So what that diagram challenges you to do is let's draw a box out to the side. And let's say if this other thing happened, is that still true? And so have people come up with ideas. Oh, what if this happened? What if this happened? What if this happened? Does it invalidate that if then? So the silly example I use is if I plant an acorn in my backyard, then an oak tree will grow, right? Logically, that makes sense because oak trees grow from acorns, right? So the way you would challenge assumption is like, okay, well, what else needs to be in here, right? So some people come up, well, your dirt has to be the right type of dirt, right? So you can't just assume that's the right type of dirt. Rainfall, right? So there are some areas that oak trees will grow and some not. Maybe you're not in the right environment, right? And so the one for me that I always come up with is like squirrels. I said, I have a lot of squirrels in my backyard, so I can't assume an oak tree is ever going to grow because that squirrel might find that acorn, right? So that's kind of like, the black swan thinking. But that's what you want to do. And that's a good exercise. You can do it on your own if you just draw the diagram, or you can do it in a group, which is even better. And that's really simple to do. But for big deals, you should do something like that. So I'll give you another example where someone should have challenged assumptions, and that's on the Segway. You remember the Segway?
We do.
Yeah.
It's a great little fun thing to go when you're on vacation.
Yeah, exactly. And so the engineer had been very successful inventing other things, right? But this was his opus. He loved the Segway, thought it was great. He had all these big thinkers like Steve Jobs and other tech folks that said it was the greatest thing ever. They were even saying that they're going to design cities around this because it's so cool. It was a complete flop, right? So the assumption was that they didn't challenge is that your average Joe is going to pay as much as a cheap car for this two-wheeled slow thing, right?
Yeah, interesting.
They just assumed it's so good that people will buy it. And that assumption was never challenged. They didn't do a market analysis to see if people would even buy it, right? That's pretty arrogant.
Yeah. I find that asking questions tends to really get people going. And sometimes people get really frustrated. So to go back all the way to the beginning, we spoke about how do you convince people to buy into the system. And you mentioned that Goldratt was a Socratic method thinker, and that's all about questions and answers. So if you're asking people questions, and I don't know what your experience is, but often I find that people don't like to think. Well, if you know the answer, why don't you just tell me? And then you tell them the answer, and then they have all the reasons why it wasn't a good answer. So it's an interesting thing about how do you properly find good answers? How do you create a culture where questioning assumptions is not viewed with frustration, Rather, it's viewed with openness and select a better term, a passion for learning.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to Deming on this one, right? So he said you have to remove fear in the workplace. And so I've been to a lot of factories, and the management isn't open to challenging assumptions. They're saying, here's your job, just do it, and don't ask questions, right? They're not transparent. They don't want their input. They think, oh, well, I'm management. You're just a line worker. What could you possibly teach me? Right. So that arrogance again, right?
Right.
And I see that attitude a lot. I've even been to companies where they, they just basically treat their employees like commodities. And so if you have that environment, then yeah, you won't get this, right? The other one is, measurements. So Goldratt says, tell me how you measure me and I'll tell you how I behave. And so sometimes part of this is you have KPIs or bonuses or whatever that are tied to something that's moving your way from what you really want. And you don't really get that. And so those are the things that I've seen. So creating a good culture, it's got to start from the top. They have to want that culture. And I've been in a lot of places where they just don't care. They're like, okay, I've been doing it this way and I'm making money. So why do I have to change?
Right.
Goldratt had an easier time as a consultant than I did, right? Because people came to Goldratt when they were hurting, right?
Right.
We have a big problem. We're hurting and we need you, Mr. Guru, to come help us. It's much harder when you're just, casually visiting a place and say, I'm noticing this. I think you could be doing this, this, and this. They're like, well, why would we want to do that, Dave?
We're fine.
We're fine.
Right.
So, yeah, my answer is when they say, well, we did 25% increase in sales year over year. It's our best ever. Why would we possibly want to change anything? And my answer is, well, maybe it should have been 50%.
Right. Yeah. Do you remember the show Undercover Boss? I don't know if it's still on.
I do.
Yeah. One of my, by the way, to your point about listening to the people who are actually doing the work or observing their outstanding work, I think one of the ones that stayed with me the most was the 7-Eleven episode, where they had one particular store that was selling, I think, quadruple the amount of coffee than any other store. And it turns out that the woman, I'm going to call her Doris, who was running the coffee station, was friends with everybody. And they weren't just coming in for their coffee. They were coming in for their moment of sunshine with Doris. Yep. And I don't know how you replicate something like that. And this is totally off topic, but, I think just the ability to be able to notice that literally everybody has something to teach.
Yeah.
And the arrogance that you've mentioned is really a big killer in just success in general. So if somebody is interested in getting into this or, changing a career and moving into something that is more theory of a constraint related, what would you recommend? How would you recommend getting started?
Well, of course, I'm going to recommend reading The Goal, right?
Me too.
And interestingly, there's a newer book out called Goldratt's Rules of Flow that was written by his daughter. And so some people find that more accessible than The Goal, but it both are good reads and both would be a good introduction. And then, there's an organization, the TOCICO organization, that has resources. They have events. They just had one in Germany. So that's a great resource if you want to learn more about it. What I wouldn't recommend is just going out and Googling and YouTube videos because there's just so much garbage out there. There are so many people that say they're teaching TOC and they get some key concepts wrong. Even at I've seen like university professors are teaching this in business school, and they just really water it down, and they get some things wrong. And the thing they usually get wrong is the fact that you want to get rid of your constraint or break your bottleneck. That's not necessarily true. It depends. If it's not in the place you want it, or it doesn't make sense to be there, yeah, might want to break it and move it. But what you really want to do is get the most out of it in most cases. So I will caution you about what sources that you look for. There are plenty of good books on it. I don't think I've read a book on TOC that I thought really got it wrong, but I've seen a lot of videos where they didn't get it right.
Interesting. Breaking the constraint when it's not necessary. In other words, if I understand that the flow of my system is X and I'm okay with X, but yet for other reasons, I want to break that constraint.
Yeah. So there might be some strategic value or something else that means, okay, we'd really because the constraint is also a control point. And so a lot of people don't think about it. It's like your tap on the faucet, right? Would you want to remove the tap on your faucet so the water runs more all the time? No.
In your kitchen.
Right. In your kitchen. And your factory is the same, right? You want to have a control point. So it helps you maintain your factory at the right pace. And then you understand the flow and your capacity if you understand your constraint. So sometimes, here's another good example. If you're building a new factory, you can build it with the constraint in the place you want it.
Fascinating. So right? That becomes a thinking exercise on how I want this process to look when I'm done.
Yeah, Go-Red had what he called the 5 focusing steps. And the first one is identify the constraint. And he made it very clear that can be identify where it is, but it can also be identify where you want it.
Interesting. I like that. I don't remember that from the goal, but then again, I'm probably due for a reread.
And like I said, it really didn't come out in the goal. That was something that came out later. If you watch some of Go-Rat's teachings, those things come out, and in later published works that comes out as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have found a bunch of his videos online that you can find on YouTube, and I would imagine that you would recommend those.
That's a good source.
Yeah, it's interesting. And what I find fascinating about this particular thinking system is that it itself is continuing to grow its body of knowledge.
Absolutely.
Which is unusual, I would think. I don't know. It just seems a little bit unusual. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's not unusual to me, right? Because being a biologist with science background, that's the whole point of theories, right? So a lot of folks think, oh, it's a theory, it's not practical. It's like, no, you don't understand the way science works. Everything's a theory. And you don't try to prove a theory right. You try to prove a theory wrong. Your experiments are trying to prove it wrong. And if you do an experiment and you don't prove it wrong, you say the theory is still valid, right? Did you ever hear something called the theory of gravity? Right? Why do we call it a theory of gravity? Haven't we proven that it's true?
Yeah.
No. The thing is, with theories, you can't prove they're true. You can only prove they're untrue.
I think you should try and explain this to my 15-year-old son, who, in his argumentative phase, decided that the theory of relativity was just a theory and therefore cannot possibly be right, and decided to argue all he could against Einstein's math.
Right. Okay. Well, the thing is, the theory of relativity is a really good example because they know some things are wrong. But the reason it's the theory that it is because they don't have anything better right now. It's the best fit that they have, but they're still trying to make it better. And so hence theory of constraints, right? Right now, there hasn't been a system found that didn't have a constraint. So therefore, the theory is valid.
Could you conceive of a system that has no constraint?
No, I can't.
Well, certainly not in the world that we live in, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Because almost by definition, anything that's a process would have something that happens faster than something else.
Well, it goes back to what I said before about the balanced line, right? They say the balanced line, well, it's balanced as much as they can get it, right? But if you start looking at smaller and smaller increments, you find that it's not really balanced. And in fact, sometimes it causes a real problem because you made two things so close to each other that the variation makes the constraint woggle from one to the other. And when you're managing the factory, that's not a good thing.
Interesting. In our last few minutes here, I know you mentioned that you're an investor and you're looking for a factory. If you want to perhaps mention something to the listeners in case people would want to know what you're looking for and could potentially reach out, and how could they do that to you? How could they reach out to you?
So I'm really fond of component makers. So, the people that are making the guts or the shells for other people's products, metal workers, like CNC shops, stamping operations, metal forming, plastic injection molders, or electronics. And that could be anywhere from the PCB boards to smaller components or subcomponents to what they call box builds. So those are the types of things I'm looking for. 3 to 10 million in revenue is the range size of company I'm looking for. And I'm in Illinois, so closer is better. But anywhere in the continental U.S., I would be open to a conversation. What I'd really like to find is, someone that's over 60 and saying, okay, it's time for me to think about what I'm going to do next. And they don't have someone to take the business over. That's kind of the perfect situation for me.
And that would be, like you said, in the continental United States, although preferably closer to Illinois, and something that makes something for other systems, parts, things. Very cool. Very cool. And just out of curiosity, one of the things that I really love about being in the IT business is that literally everything changes very, very frequently. I would imagine that with a lot of these manufacturing systems, the change is a little slower, but then again, I've never been in this business. So I wanted to ask you, are the days the same or are they different? What is that like in a manufacturing business?
Yeah. So manufacturers, especially the metal workers, tend to not change very much. I've been to factories where they're still using equipment from the 1940s.
Really?
And they work. So there's really no reason to replace them. So could they do new stuff? I mean, the one that I can think of in particular is what they're called Swiss machines or wire Swiss machines, and they're programmed with cams, right? They're not computers. So you change the cams in them to get the different product coming out, and that's very interesting. And so, some of those have been in use, for close to 100 years now. And then there are other things that are different. So the electronics industry is probably the one where I see the most change. So they have machines that, when you have a board and you have to populate with all the components, they have machines they call a pick and place, right? Those they update routinely because they keep getting faster and they keep being able to do smaller components. And that's necessary to keep up with new designs. So old metalworking probably changes the slowest. Electronics probably changes the fastest.
Fascinating. So I'm sorry, what I forgot to remind you to say, if people wanted to reach out to you, Dave, how should they do so?
Yeah, so they can reach out to me. My LinkedIn profile is probably the best place to reach out to me. So you can just message me on LinkedIn or connect with me. I also have my contact info in there. My email address is in there. My phone number is even in there. I don't get enough calls yet that I have to take that out of there. And then there's also a button that you can actually schedule a 30-minute meeting with me. So right at this point, I'm pretty free with my time. I'm not busy enough that I have to cut that off. So lots of ways to contact me.
Well, Dave, I'm certainly super excited for you to find this next factory and the next challenge in your life. And I'm incredibly grateful that you've educated me and hopefully our listeners as well about theory of constraints and Goldratt and Deming and Six Sigma and Lean. We spoke about a bunch of different things, which I thought were fascinating. As somebody who's in the professional services arena, project management in particular, but any process that requires multiple steps, thinking about it in a term of a constraint and not always thinking that everybody needs to be busy all the time, because sometimes the busyness that you're creating is going to ultimately create a delay in the delivery of the overall system. And I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you very, very much for joining us today, Dave. And I'm going to wrap up with a word from our sponsor. Ventures and Visionaries is sponsored by KJ Technology. KJ Technology provides advisory, cybersecurity, and proactive process consulting. KJ also provides a fully managed IT service package. Please feel free to reach out. You can reach out to me. It's on my LinkedIn page. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me, Morty.
My pleasure.